So this is my minimum definition for friendship is that it's long-lasting and stable relationship. It's positive, makes you feel good, and it's reciprocal or cooperative. In fact, there's a study, somebody actually counted up how much time you have to spend with someone to consider them a friend, a good friend, and a best friend. It's 50 hours of time together to go from an acquaintance to a friend, about 80 or 90 hours to consider someone a good friend, and about 200 hours of time together before you consider someone a best friend.
Hey friends, and welcome to this episode of Growth Island. Today we're going to talk about something that is close to all of us. It's about friendships. So how do you find those good friends? What is a good friend? Well, for that, I found an expert on the subject. I found Lydia Denworth. She wrote a really good book about friendships. It's called Friendship, the Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life Fundamental Bond. It's something that affects all of us. You say that you can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends. So what do we actually do? She is also an editor for Scientific American. She's a writer for Psychology Today. She's been appearing a ton of amazing places, and she's just a wealth of knowledge. So I'm extremely grateful to have Lydia on. Lydia, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
How did you end up writing a book on friendship?
Well, this is my third book. So when I finished the last one, I was sort of casting around for what I might do next. And I'm a science writer by profession. So my job takes me out, or it did pre-pandemic, to conferences to meet people. And mainly I have to listen to scientists talk about what they're working on, what they think is interesting and surprising. And I was noticing that more and more people were talking about friendship and talking about it in a way that seemed different from how most of us think about friendship. So this was neuroscientists and primatologists and evolutionary biologists. And it seemed like there was a sort of additional story to tell about friendship, about how seriously scientists are taking it now and how much respect they're giving it. And I think a lot of us take friendship a little bit for granted, or we did before the pandemic anyway, when we all went into social isolation. So I was intrigued by the science. I thought there was a story to tell, but also I thought, hey, I could spend a couple years digging into this topic, because who wouldn't want to learn a little bit more about friendship and then maybe, hopefully, get to be a little bit better at being a good friend, right?
Yeah. So I think many people have different understandings of a friendship. Many people are like, that's my friend. And other people are like, how do you understand a friendship?
So, yeah. So technically, one way that people think of friends is literally they are the people you are not related to and that you don't have sex with. That's one way. That's one way of thinking of it. But my definition of friendship is based on the scientists, and especially evolutionary biologists, who have figured out that what we're really talking about here are close, strong, positive bonds. And they have three requirements. So this is my minimum definition for friendship is that it's long-lasting and stable relationship. It's positive, makes you feel good, and it's reciprocal or cooperative. So there's a back and forth and a give and take. And a lot of the other things that we think of when we think of friendship, like trust and loyalty and companionship, they can drop into those three buckets, I think. The long-lasting, positive, reciprocal.
And what's long-lasting?
Well, it means, so you can like someone from the minute you meet, but it takes time to develop a good, strong, deep bond, right? And so it means, if you translate this definition of friendship into what it means to be a good friend, it's to be a steady, reliable presence in someone's life. So that's kind of what the long-lasting, stable part is. A steady, reliable presence, and then a positive relationship. So it needs to make both people feel good. And that sounds simple, but there's a lot of friendships in our lives that are a little more complicated than that, right? And we can come back to that and what that means. And then the last part, the reciprocal cooperative part, is that it doesn't have to be a kind of, so it translates into being a steady, reliable presence, being positive, appreciating your friends, telling them what you like about them, things like that. We don't always do that with our friends. We don't stop and say, I really appreciate this about you, or you make me feel good when you do this, or whatever it is. And the reciprocal cooperative part means to show up, to be helpful, right? And I mean, show up in the broadest sense of the phrase. Show up in person when that's possible and important, even if it's maybe a little inconvenient for you. Show up online. Show up by texting and saying, hey, I know you have this thing today. Just want to tell you I'm thinking about you, or just checking in, see how you're doing, and show up when it's hard for you as is part of what I'm talking about here. Being helpful, having this give and take in a relationship turns out to be really important. It's not and I'm not talking about like a strict accounting of you do this for me, so now I do that for you. In fact, with our best relationships, we get past that and we kind of forget. We stop keeping score. And that's a beautiful thing. But it does matter that over time, there's a kind of back and forth and equality, right? And that it can't be that one person is doing all the giving and the other all the taking, or one is doing all the talking and the other one is always the one listening and never sort of getting to share. So that's for me what friendship is. And the reason that definition is important is because on some levels, it clarifies friendship, but it also blurs the lines in terms of who can be friends with who. Because by my definition, what we're talking about is a quality relationship with somebody you're really close to and that you can count on. And that actually can be a romantic partner or a biological relative or not. Like some of those relationships are complicated, right? Well, let me put it this way. To me, friend is a qualitative word that tells me about the quality of your relationship with someone. And if you tell me that your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend is your best friend, you're adding to what I know about your relationship, right? You're telling me that there's this extra sort of special piece to it. And so I guess I think of it as this really strong quality bond that is the thing. The science tells us that those kinds of relationships are critical for our health. Over the long haul, they're as important as diet and exercise in keeping you healthy and living a long life. And that's the piece. You may think friendship is good for you, but most of us do not understand just how good for you it is. But to get that help, that physical sort of benefit to your health and longevity, it needs to fit this definition that I just gave you.
Got it. So I definitely also see that community is something that I'm hearing more and more about. There's a lot of discussion about the blue zones, whether it's actually correct or not, or whether they actually are places where they didn't count the age properly. But at least one of the things that they're finding there is a strong community and some long-lasting friendships, right? Low stress, other things as well. But it seems to be one of the things that characterizes all of the blue zones. So what's the difference on a good friend and a great friend?
Yeah. I guess it goes back to some of what I was just saying. So a great friend is really someone who you can count on and who my closest friends are the people that I can call at any time to say, I need to talk to you about this thing. And then there's a whole lot of people who I really enjoy and I spend time with and I think of as good friends, but I'm not going to go that extra. I would worry about sort of intruding on them with my own stuff that's going on, right? Whereas your great friends, I think you feel will be there for you. I don't know. What is it for you? What's the difference between your good and your great friends?
I would actually agree a lot. So the great friends are, for me, so some people I just feel I have more fun with. It is more easy to be with. It's kind of like chemistry, right? That there's like totally levels, like you can meet people and they're great people and so on. And then there are those people where it sinks on a different level, you connect at a different level. So for me, it's that part. And then it's also that I can trust them, that I like this. A few people that I know, those are the ones that I would call. And the fun thing when we talk about it, several of those are not the ones that I see that much any longer. Several of those are actually some of my oldest friends that we almost lost connection with. But I still have a feeling like if everything burned down, they would still be some of the ones that I could count on the most, which is also put the whole like historical perspective in, right?
Yeah, that's why the long-lasting part of friendship is so important, because when you have shared history, that gives a richness and a depth to your relationship. That said, I also have found that a lot of people hang on to some of those long-term relationships and think that they are good for them when in fact they'll say, oh, we have all this shared history, but I find this person really draining. And so I do think it's important to recognize that shared history is a wonderful thing and it can make a relationship really great, but it by itself is not necessarily enough. They have to be there for you and they have to still make you feel good.
And sometimes you grow apart. I remember listening to a radio and they were talking about like that friend, that semi-toxic friend that's always negative, pulling you back. And I found at least that's been very hard when you're kind of growing and so on. It's kind of also letting go of some people. Like you still love them with the friendship and so on, but you can see like you're just growing apart. That can be tough to make that decision. I know that's something many people struggle with, like those. They don't necessarily have to be toxic relationships. Sometimes it's also just growing apart.
Actually, I think that the toxic relationships on some level are easier because they're so clear cut, right? You know, this isn't a good, healthy relationship anymore. Even though it can still be hard to walk away from people, it's at least you know you probably should. It's those ambiguous relationships in the middle that are harder. One of the things that I have learned is how important it is that these, at least a core group of relationships at the center of your life are really strong and positive in all the ways I've just described. And if somebody else is trying to claim, well, let me put it this way. We have limited time in our day and in our lives, right? And we give a certain amount. We have to put in time both to make and to maintain friendships. And so we got to give the bulk of it to those first core people who really who sustain our soul. The other people, the ones that, that you're talking about that feel negative or that, what I like to imagine is that you have these friendship circles, right? You have your inner circle and then you have this sort of one out and another one out and they get further and further. You could shuffle people to the outer rings of your friendship life. Even if you don't say that, it's about how what you get from the relationship and how much time and effort you're going to put into it. And so you don't have to cut them out of your life, but you can you should be very aware of who serves you best emotionally.
And this brings me to one of the other questions that I had down. So there's this classic saying that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. What's your take on that? Do you agree, or is it BS, or what?
Oh, it's like a lot of things. It's got some truth to it and some BS. But I do think it's worth thinking about and examining. So the idea that your 5 closest friends are reflections of who you are and that's, if you take them together, that makes you you. I think there's something to that. I mean, we to some extent are who we hang out with. So a lot of my friends are writers like I am, or they're journalists, or they're creative people. They're middle-aged women like me. They're mothers. Maybe there's some of that. I mean, that's the obvious piece, right? They reflect you because friendship is about having shared worldview. It's about often a shared sense of humor. It's about enjoying some of the same things. I mean, quite literally, and this is fascinating to me. We've always known that there's a phrase or a cliche in English about how birds of a feather flock together, right? And you're attracted to people who are like you. And there is some truth to that. It turns out that it goes all the way into our brains, the way that we process the world. So there's new neuroscience out finding that we literally hear and see the world more like our closest friends than we do the people that we're less close to, which is essentially like the neural version of laughing at the same jokes. And neuroscientists can actually see that happening in your brain. They can predict. They did this study where they took a couple of hundred students in a graduate program, and they looked at them at the beginning of the year and then later, and they mapped out their relationships. And then they did this test where they put them in the fMRI where they could do imaging of their brain. They showed them videos and they could see how the different people's brains were responding to the videos. And they could predict just by looking at the brain responses, who was friends with who, right? And so I think it's really cool. On some levels, it makes perfect sense. It's exactly what you always knew. But on others, it's profound, right? It's telling you that the similarities that you have with people in the world go right down to the way your brain processes a video and the things that you pay attention to. And it's not just one part of your brain, it's all parts of your brain. And so we should be aware of that. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to seek out people who are different from you, because we get a lot from that. But, there apparently is this real biological draw to people that are like you. The other thing that happens is that the more time you spend together, the more your brains are going to become aligned. And so the question now, and they're still researching this, is how much do we start out the same and how much do we change by virtue of being friends? And the answer, like a lot of things, is probably some of both, right? You're drawn to someone to begin with because you share things in common, and then you become more alike as you discuss the world.
That makes a lot of sense. Lydia, I have a ton of questions more. So I'm just going to state 3 questions and we won't take them all at the same time.
Okay.
But then you have the idea. So one of them is, it can sound very transactional. Who's getting, what are you getting out of it? We'll get it. The second question is, how do you become a really good friend? And the third one, what do you do if you moved and so on, you don't have that many friends? How do you then establish and we have that long term? So those are some of the ones that I'd love to touch on. But if we start on the transactional one, some people might be listening and being like, friendship really a transaction? Isn't friendship about...
Well, I want to go back to what I said before about how in our best relationships, we've lost sight of any transactional nature to it. And it shouldn't feel that way. I mean, you were talking about the people that you just really feel connected to and enjoy. And so it should feel natural to want to do the things that I'm talking about but I do think that sometimes we are so focused on whether people are good friends to us that we fail to pay attention to whether we are good friends to them. And so maybe there's a way to think of this not as transactional, but as reciprocal, like I said, to think about, okay, how healthy is the back and forth here? And not keeping score, not counting. You had me to dinner. Now I have to have you to dinner or whatever it is, but just sort of making sure that there's a back and forth. I mean, one of my closest friends, every time we get together, we sort of say, okay, tell me your headlines. Tell me what's going on in your life that we need to talk about. And then we make sure that we both get to do that. And sometimes one of us has a whole lot more going on in our lives than the other. And so you take up more of the airtime, and other times it's the reverse or it's more even. But just that convention of that, asking that question and making sure that that's going to be part of the conversation, that you each get a turn, is more what I'm talking about. And I don't think of that as transactional at all. I just think of that as a kind of egalitarian sort of loving approach to friendship. Does that answer your question? Is that, there's a lot more to say about that probably, but I know you have a lot of questions. So
how, because I think that's probably one of the most important questions to ask is how do you become a really good friend? Not saying what are you looking in someone else, the same if you're looking for a romantic partner, people focus on, I want this person. I think the important question is, who do you have to be to attract that partner or those kind of friends, right?
Well, so I said earlier that for me, this definition of friendship that scientists have kind of come up with, and I was talking about the evolutionary biologists, but the truth is that anthropologists and people from it all kind of, there's a similarity to how we see these things. So this positive, long lasting, reliable, reciprocal, back and forth, that crosses it's a pretty universal definition, right? So to be a good friend, you need to think about those things. So like I said, you should be a steady, reliable presence for someone, and not just call them when you need them, but try to show up for them. You should be kind. You should be thoughtful. And you should help, like I said. So I think those things, and you mentioned trust. I mean, trust is hugely important, right? So that to me fits into being kind. And so not going around and talking about what your friend confessed to you to other people, or that would certainly fit in the positive box of friendship. You need a relationship to feel good for everybody. So you should be trustworthy. You should be loyal. You do not have to. I mean, there's 2 things, and this gets a little bit to your next question about how to make friends, especially if you're in a new place. But I think it also addresses the question of how to be a good friend, is to remember, especially in adulthood, that friendship requires two other things. One is time and the other is vulnerability. And so you've got to be able to put in the time, or you have to be aware that you need to put in the time. And that's something that so that's easy when you're like a teenager or you're in university, right? You're with all these people your same age. You'll never be with more people your same age again, right? And the number of potential friends is huge. And you spend a lot of time together naturally. And so then it sifts out and you start to see, of all those people, who are you drawn to? Who likes you back? They have to like you back, right? And you start to make friends. As adults, we have to work at that a little bit more because life gets busy. We have careers, maybe we have families, maybe we have both. And it gets a lot harder to have that kind of time. And we forget, though, that you need to put in that time to get to that deeper friendship. And so sometimes we're like, oh, I met these people at this thing, but I don't know. I don't feel like anybody wants to be friends with me. But that's too soon to make that judgment. In fact, there's a study, somebody actually counted up how much time you have to spend with someone to consider them a friend, a good friend, and a best friend. It's 50 hours of time together to go from an acquaintance to a friend, about 80 or 90 hours to consider someone a good friend, and about 200 hours of time together before you consider someone a best friend. And that kind of time is, like I said, easy to come by if you're if you're at a university and you live in a dorm with people and you eat with them and you're in class with them and you party with them on the weekend. It's a lot harder to do if you're just having the occasional dinner or lunch or, whatever it is. So
Lydia, where do I find that study? Because I actually had a concrete question, which you just answered. If there's other studies that look into how long it makes sense for a hobby, or see someone before you have an idea about whether it makes sense to continue. So that was the study that you just mentioned, basically.
Yeah, it's a researcher named Jeff Hall at the University of Kansas here in the U.S. I wrote about this. It's in the book, and I wrote about it in Psychology Today. And it was by far the most popular blog post I ever did for Psychology Today, was my write-up of his study. And so, yes, you can find it there. You'll get more explanation of exactly how he did this. It was both college students who were new on campus and then adults who had moved, like you just were describing, and we're in a new job in a new place and meeting people. And the thing is, time matters a lot, but time is not the only thing. I mean, in an office, you might spend 600 hours with somebody in a year and not become friends, right? So it's only one piece, but it is a necessary piece. And then the second thing I was bringing up was the vulnerability question, which is that you do have to put yourself out there a little bit, both physically. You have to actually you have to go out and try to meet people, right? It's sitting on your couch. It's very hard to make friends on your own. And then also to get to a deeper place in friendship does require sort of sharing a little bit of yourself. And some of us are really nervous about doing that. Good news is that people like us more than we think. There's another study there's sort of a line of research into the idea that actually most people enjoy talking to new people, and or afterwards, like they might not think they want to, but if you ask them, did you enjoy that conversation? Were you glad you met that person? They'll say yes, more often than not. And we get so caught up in our own heads about, I said the stupidest thing, or I didn't say anything smart. I didn't say anything, or I should have done this, right? They probably thought I was whatever, blah, blah, blah. That's what we do. That's the loop that goes in our head. And yeah, maybe sometimes there's some truth to that, but it turns out that most people are giving us more benefit of the doubt than we think, right? They like us more than we think. So that's a good thing to remember too. And so as an adult, you got to put yourself out there a little bit, and it's harder. And it is true that everybody has less time, and it might not, like the first couple people you try might not work. And I'm not trying to minimize how hard this can be for people. I know it is. But I also do think that we think it should be easier as adults than it is. We kind of forget what went into it, right?
And I've had several coaching sessions with different people where moved on. They've been doing extremely well career-wise. And they spent all of their focus on working and getting to the top. But in that process, they haven't spent the time as well to take care of their friendships and so on. And now they're at a time in life where they're looking at where they think it should be easy enough, often saying that it takes time. Like, people are busy. And often a lot of the people that you might want to have as friends, they're very busy people and have a lot of friends.
Yeah.
Especially if you're the busy type, then you often want people that are also like in that busy and they're cool. I have one friend called Mark De Silva, and I went to his wedding, and I have never met that many amazing people before in my life.
Yeah.
It was just like everyone there was you like, wow, these people are so sweet and so heartfelt, right? So he's a person that just attracts people. That's the kind of person you want to be friends with. But that also means he has a ton of good friends already. So it's hard to get time with him.
Right.
So it's also, you got to find ways where you're contributing value to them. Is at least what I've told some of my coaches is, can you find things that they love to do as well, that you love to do? And can you then propose things where you have a better bond together than potentially just going for lunch? Is there anything that could be more interesting so people will find and prioritize that time? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I was saying that it has a lot to do with shared interests. And I agree that, I don't know, if you both like to go hiking, say, planning a friendship around a walk or something. I mean, getting together and talking to someone while you're also out exercising or hiking or doing whatever you enjoy is like such a win-win, right? Across the board, you're getting exercise, you're talking to someone, you're doing something you both enjoy. And I've heard people say that like when they've moved to new cities, they'll look for, it sounds corny, right? But there'll be like a craft beer club or something in this new city. And so they'll go to these funky bars that make their own beer, and they'll find other people who like that, or they'll suggest that as a thing to go do with somebody new. And I think that's it. The reason people give that advice all the time is because it works. So like I said, it sounds kind of corny, but it does work. So I agree with you that doing things together is a useful thing all through friendship, but especially at the beginning. And it also is a little bit more true for men, so there's stereotypes of men and women and how they do friendship. And the stereotype is that women do friendship face to face, which means that they talk all the time, right? And that men do friendship side by side. So they do things together. They play sports or watch sports or sit next to each other on bar stools or whatever it is. But there's less of that intense self-disclosure or discussion of how you feel about things. It's a stereotype, but so it doesn't apply to everyone, but there's some truth to it, right? And a lot of that difference is cultural. It's in what we teach men to expect and women to expect in their friendships. But so I don't know. Now I'm forgetting what your actual question was at the beginning, but I think I've probably covered it.
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
So a question that often comes up as well is friendship between men and women.
Yeah, totally possible. And obviously it gets complicated by romantic interest, but there's a lot of people who are good friends. The classic joke is like a lot of women, like their gay male friends can be their very best friends, right? Because then you get rid of all the sexual tension. But I think it is one of these things too, culturally, that we have a harder time with sometimes, that the idea that men and women can really be friends independently. But I've also heard of, so among adolescent girls, I was just talking to someone who was saying that his daughter had all male friends in high school, and that's who she was close to. The things she liked to do there were more boys involved. And some of the other people in this conversation, it was a talk I was giving, were saying like, well, that's because friendship among girls in the teenage years can be difficult. And this girl's probably like, this is simpler and this is who I like and who I want to talk to. And so I think we should encourage that, and we shouldn't say it's not possible. It is true though that your instincts about friendship might be a little bit different if you're a girl or a boy, a woman or a man. And so, but I am all for supporting the cross-gender, cross-sex friendships.
Yeah. What are some things we can do to accelerate friendship? So you talked about vulnerability and time. And I found that I participated in something called Came to North, which is personal development, personal leadership for teenagers like 14 to 19. And there we have an exercise called If You Knew Me Better. People in a circle, and then they share something like for a minute or 2 minutes. If you knew me better, you would know this. And I've seen, it's crazy how you've known someone for a day and suddenly you almost feel closer to them than people you've known for years because you share something very vulnerable.
Right. So actually, I mean, and there is a kind of famous study out there. I think it's 36 questions that lead to laws. Have you heard of this?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's basically getting exactly at what you're talking about. And the actual questions, if people sign up for my newsletter on my website, you can get as a bonus the actual questions. The researchers let me put it up, but it was done when people were studying romantic relationships in the lab. They needed a way to generate closeness quickly. And so they created all these questions. I mean, this is, you know what it is, but I'll explain in case other people don't. But people have used it for friendship as well now and to study friendship. And so they've brought in same-sex friends, heterosexual same-sex friends, like especially men. She was studying friendship among men. And the questions, the 36 questions, they proceed, right? They start out pretty easy and not too revealing, right? And then they get more and more personal as you go along. And what she found was that the men, when she put two men in a room to ask them to do this as friends, they were really uncomfortable. As she said, they looked like deer in the headlights. They cursed a little bit when the questions would get asked. I'm not sure what's allowed to be said on your podcast, but the F word and things like that. But then they answered the questions and they revealed quite a lot. And they all said they felt closer at the end, right? And now this was an artificial setup, but it is something we can do for sure. Both people have to be willing to do it, because the other way it works is that you go back and forth, right? So you answer a question, I answer a question. So it has to be shared. But I mean, it is definitely true that shared self-disclosure, to use the psychological term, usually makes us feel closer to people. The other thing, I mean, there's a lot of research in how children make friends. There's a sort of very long-standing idea that is pretty straightforward, but I think applies to adults as well, which is that kids first get to be friendly with other kids by doing things together, by they're in the same class or they're on a team together or something like that. And then there's a second stage where they share an emotional experience together. And that can be in talking about, how you feel, your self-disclosure about it. Or it can be the way you feel like if you're on a sports team and you win together or something, right? There's this real bonding feeling that you get. Or think about, famously, people in the military who go through intense experiences together are much closer afterwards. Two of my kids did outdoor. They spent a couple of months. They did semesters away in the wilderness in Colorado here in the US and went hiking, and they have these intense experiences with the kids that they're with, but they come away really drawn to them. Now, that is not something that you can just throw into your everyday life, but I think we can take some pieces of it and think, okay, we could look for opportunities to do things that are maybe a little bit more intense or challenging, but that if we do them well together, we might be closer in the end.
I've seen that CrossFit is people have extremely close community of friendship, and they get it very fast. It's the same as the military. You do some
there you go. Great.
You see some fighting gyms as well, where you have the respect for each other, but you do things that are really hard and you're cheering for each other. So at least that's what I've seen as well. Things where it's very hard, or you work extremely intense on something, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have that bond afterwards. Do we know why that is? Is there anything with the brain? Well,
I think, so it's true that the more intense the experience, the more the memories of it are etched into your brain. It's partly also why a lot of our experiences as adolescents, we remember more clearly and sort of viscerally. Our brain actually responded to them differently at that time in our lives. And so the things that feel good feel really good, and the things that feel bad feel just awful, 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 right? When you're an adolescent. But it's still true that emotion and intensity accelerates kind of everything that we're responding to. And if you're succeeding at it, you're getting the dopamine rush and the kind of the happy hormones then that you feel like your adrenaline's going. And then the people around you who are part of that, you share that feeling together. So it's definitely true. It's a little bit the thing of your brain is processing the experience in the same way, just like I was saying, and then watching videos, it's a slightly different parts of the brain, but I think there's something to that. I don't know I haven't really seen the neuroscience on like why in the military people are closer, but it's something that we know is absolutely true. That those intense experiences. It's also the case like with people who work in a job where they have to work all kinds of ridiculous hours and they come through a kind of crucible together and then they can be intensely bonded as well.
Yeah. Lydia, what would you do if you were like moving to a new country or where you couldn't bring your friends, or say that you had kind of gone from not living such a healthy life to being a troublemaker or something else, and you're kind of like, you needed a new circle of friends?
Wow, nobody's asked me that last one. I have had the experience of moving to another country, and now I went with my husband and my kids, but we moved to Hong Kong from New York for a couple of years, and I found it really hard. I found it hard to find the friends that I could relate to in ways that felt comfortable for me. In Brooklyn, where I live, you can throw a stone and you will hit 10 writers who work from home who sort of do what I do. Anyway, there's like a lot of that kind of starting in a similar place and then seeing if you can connect. And in Hong Kong, it just wasn't that way at all, especially because I was part of the expat world and a lot of they were mostly the wives had followed the husbands, although there were a few husbands following their wives, but most of them were not working, partly because the rules make it hard to work, or they were working in a corporate job and then they were working all the time. So the ones who were not working, they spent their days doing all kinds of stuff that I didn't really have time to do because I was still working as a writer. And so I wasn't really able to spend the time to get to know them, but then the other people were. Anyway, it was hard to find so I had to just keep working at it, meeting different people. And I also did try to carve out time to do the things that some of the people were doing, at least a little bit. And hiking turns out to be a really big thing in Hong Kong. That's one of the reasons why it's top of mind. I brought it up earlier. I didn't realize that when I got there, but the way the geography of Hong Kong is this, it's like mountains drop down into the South China Sea. And so there's all these trails along the people live around the edges and the middle is all these trails. And so it's a great way to get exercise and it's something that people do together. So I would sometimes, and I could do this because I work for myself, I would take a morning and go and meet these women and go hiking so that I could get to know them better, even though normally I wouldn't have done that at that time of day, right? It was worth it to me to do that. So trying to sort of figure out whatever that means for you, you have to make. And then the other thing that I think happens in those kinds of situations is that you make friends with who's there and you share the bond you have, and maybe they wouldn't be people you would be friends with if you met in another place and time, but that's okay. It serves a purpose and you definitely benefit from having that bond. Now, your second question about trying to change your surroundings, I think is what you're talking about, right? If your friends have not been a great influence, or I'm assuming like you're trying to stop drinking or something and you don't want to just keep going to the same bars. It's so hard, but it is also essential. It is essential to find people who do other things. And I think the way to start is by looking for it, like looking for whatever that other activity is that feels healthier. And there have to be some people out there doing that, right? And so you've got to go find them. But again, you have to put yourself out there and be a little bit vulnerable about it. But it's very true that friends can be a great influence on us or not so much, right?
Is there a limit on how many friends you can have? You talked about the 5 and you said it takes time, right?
Yeah. Well, so there's kind of famously some science saying that like none of us can have more than about like 100, it was 150. It has to do with your brain capacity for keeping track of people. So most of us, the average in our inner circle is just 4. And that can be family, it can be friends, it can be a mix. I think it's, let's say, it's like between 2 and 8 most of us have in that inner circle. And then we have 10 to 15 in the next circle, which maybe, let's call it the first people you'd invite to your birthday party or something, right? And then you have these extended circles that get bigger. And some of us, we have different friendship styles. We have a tendency to just want to have a couple of intense one-on-one relationships, or where someone like your friend whose wedding you went to, who just gathers people around them and connects people too, probably, I'm guessing. But there clearly is a limit both in your brain capacity and just in the amount of time you can spend in a day or in your life with people. So that's why there's these, you can think of these concentric circles and think of you're going to devote the bulk of your time to the people in the center of the circle, right? The science about saying like that I think it's been a little while since I looked at it. I'm pretty sure what it says, like most of us, maybe you can't have more than, I think, 150 friends, and you can't remember more than 1,500 people or something like that, like names and faces. And obviously some of us can't even do that, but it's more that like your brain capacity is limited. But so I really do think, though, one important message is that quality is more important than quantity for friendship, and that while there are a lot of benefits to having a lot of friends and getting that variety, we talked about the 5 people around you, that one of the things though is like having a bench. I'm big with the sports stuff today. I don't know, but here, so having people you can count on if somebody else isn't available, or maybe you need someone like to talk about a work thing with, and then you need someone to talk about a parenting thing with, or you need someone to talk about like your relationship with your romantic partner. And you want somebody who's got some experience of that, right? Of whatever it is you're talking about. So that can be helpful. But to get the health benefits of friendship, you really only need, honestly, the biggest difference is between 0 and 1 friends. And I haven't actually touched on that, and I do want to make sure we include. So I said that friendship over the long haul can be as important as diet and exercise. I think I said that. But it affects your cardiovascular functioning, your immune system, your cognitive health, your mental health, your stress response, the way you sleep. It even affects how fast you age biologically. And not surprisingly, then all of that adds up to it affecting how long you live even. So friendship on the one hand is good for all that stuff, and loneliness or social isolation on the other hand is bad for it. And so this is why I say this is so important. But to get those health benefits, you really only need 1 friend. Like that will do it. That will give you the bang for your buck. More can be better, but it's not essential. And so I think that is the thing that people need to remember, especially if friendship feels hard for them.
So what if someone had that one good friend and they got into a fight? Because that's another thing. Long friendships and then suddenly people fight.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's the reason why it can be good to have a couple of backup. But one thing I think is important is that we don't always think about working at friendship to make it better. We tend to avoid the hard conversations, partly because one of the major things about friendship is that it's voluntary, right? And that's actually a beautiful part. And like you said, we can choose our friends, but we can't choose our family. But sometimes it means we walk away, or we just kind of avoid the hard stuff. And so I would argue that if you think the friendship is a really important one and a special one, that it's worth trying to have those harder conversations when you have a fight and so be honest. I mean, I suppose if you have the fight and things are not going well and you try to have the conversation, I mean, the worst thing that happens is you stay where you are, right? Because now you're still not getting along, but at least you've tried. So I do think we should think about friendship that way. But I also think that, like I said, if it's not a relationship that's going to be healthy for you, that it is important to start looking elsewhere. So if you have that one friend and you get into a fight, well, then you're going to have to do the work of finding somebody else. I've been going on, but this reminds me though. So some of the really important science from the evolutionary biologists was done in other species and other animals, right? I have a lot of that in the book. But famously, there was this baboon called Sylvia who lived in Africa. And Sylvia was really kind of a bitch. And she was not nice to the other baboons in her troop. And she really mostly hung out with her daughter, Sierra. That was her primary grooming partner. And grooming is gold for baboons and other kinds of non-human primates. And then, sadly for Sylvia, Sierra was killed by a lion, which happens when you're a baboon living in Africa, right? And what was really interesting is that there were some scientists watching this troop, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't know about this. They'd been watching these animals for a very long time. They had all this information on them. So they knew what Sylvia was like. And they expected her to go off and grieve all on her own and just continue to be her kind of snarky self. And she didn't. She changed. And there's a grunt that baboons give when they sort of come in peace. And that's what she started to do. She started to try to approach all these other baboons in a friendlier way. And it was surprising for the scientists. I'm sure it was surprising for the baboons as well. But it made the scientists ask, well, why would she be doing that? What's in it for Sylvia? Why? She's lost this critical relationship and she's changing her behavior in order to build new relationships. And so that is what made them start to do this very important research that became a big important study that was published in Science, one of the most prestigious journals there is, in 2003. Because what they did was they essentially came up with a way of counting how often the baboons were nice to each other. And then they used that index that they'd created and they measured it against ultimately how many babies, how healthy your babies were, how many babies you had, and how healthy they were. So reproductive success, and how long the baboons lived. And what they found was that the baboons with the strongest positive social bonds lived longer and had more and healthier babies. And so that is what shows us that friendship is that there are real evolutionary advantages to being good at making and maintaining friends. And we suspect that Sylvia figured that out, that she knew she couldn't be entirely on her own, right? Or that would be less good for her. And that's where we started to see that the relationships among these animals actually had a lot to teach us about relationships among humans, and that they help to explain why all those health things are going on and how some friendship that exists outside the body, how it can get inside your cells and change how you respond to a virus, say, can make you more or less susceptible to a virus. That seems incredible. That's not an obvious thing, but that is what's going on. So that's what, if you're Sylvia and you lose your friend, you're going to have to do that work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Lydia, time is running. I'm not sure how hard of a hard stop you have.
I'm good.
Okay. So 2 more questions I would love to get you for that. What is there anything you have changed in regards to your relationships after you wrote this book?
I try harder to show up. Like I said, I try harder. I think a lot of us have a tendency, and I raise my hand, guilty, especially in my sort of really busy midlife when my kids were younger and I was working hard, and I'll say, oh, yes. Let's get together. And I mean it, but then I wouldn't follow through. I wouldn't make the plan, or I wouldn't. And sometimes you cancel on your friends. They would tend to be like the first thing to go after family and work and romance and whatever. And it's not that those other things are not important. Family, work, romantic partner, all deserve time and attention, but friends really do too. I like to say that I think this new science of friendship gives us permission to hang out with our friends and understand that we're doing something really important for ourselves. We're not just faffing off, as they say. I don't think we've given it the respect that it's due, that time. And so I have tried to take that to heart and to make sure that I try to show up for my friends. I don't do it. You're never going to get it all right, but I try to do that, and I try to make time and prioritize. And I will say, for people who are parents, I try to do the same thing in thinking about my kids. Now, my kids are 18, 20, 23 now, so they're getting bigger, but I try to recognize how important it is for them to spend time with their friends. And parents often are so focused on schoolwork or whatever it is. That's what we tend to talk to our kids about. And I'm trying to talk to my kids more about how to be a good friend, how to make time for friends, and I think that a lot of us could do more of that. For people who are parents, however old your kid is, like, there's probably a way to understand just how important friendship is going to be in their lives and to help them be better at it, but also to recognize that maybe they should go spend time with this friend tonight and not study for this test.
Yeah. I definitely believe that social relations and friends and so on is going to be one of the bigger things. I often talk about the fundamentals of health being rest, sleep,
yes,
movement, being what you eat, nutrition, being your mindset, and then your social relationships. Because those are kind of the 5 things, and you can discuss light is important as well. But like, that's again, at least what I see from science as well and research being like the cornerstones. And I really believe like you've seen like the next big thing we're going to be talking more about. And I I'm very much in these biohacking circles where people talk very much about biology and tracking and testing. But a lot of them also have realized the importance of friendship. And that it's something that is not being looked at lightly. That it's just, it's not that important. You just need to focus on movement, right?
Yeah, no, this is exactly right. And I think the pandemic really helped us in this. I found that people, you don't know what you have till it's gone, right? Appreciate just how important these relationships were to your day-to-day functioning until we couldn't have them. And so I hope that we all come out of this sort of terrible time we've been in, like doing a refresh on our friendships and taking them seriously and making a plan to make sure that we have some really good ones in there. Even if we have to manage some less great relationships, let's make sure we've got a couple of good ones. And I just want to say too, in case it persuades people as much as it did me, one of my favorite statistics in all the research I did is one that's pretty well known, but there's a study at Harvard called the Adult Development Study that went on for most of the 20th century, and they followed these men for their whole lives. And so when they got into their 80s, the ones that survived, they were able to go back and look at all kinds of like what was the best predictor of who was healthy and happy at 80. And it wasn't your cholesterol level or your wealth or your professional success. It was how satisfied you had been with your relationships at 50. Right. And 50, of course, is that age where we're often busy and we're not putting in the time. And I'm guessing maybe your listeners are younger than that, but keep it in mind. That kind of blows me away that you want to live a good, long, healthy life. Well, this was the number one important thing. And so that's the thing I think everybody needs to take from this is just, and how fortunate for us because it's fun, right? Like it's fun to hang out with people that you love and that are nice to you.
Yeah. So Lydia, if you had to give a short, concrete advice for the people that might be struggling a little bit with friendships and finding them and constantly getting into fights, I would recommend them read your book. I would recommend them How to Win Friends and Talk to Anyone, or How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is a classic. The title sounds awful because it sounds so manipulative, but when you listen to the book, it's very much about how to be a good human being and treat other people well. It's not really about manipulation, at least in my point of view. It's very much about if your parents didn't teach you really well, how do you show up? And you might not have learned it. And then there's another book called How to Talk to Anyone, which is very concrete things when you meet people. Are there any other books or like short, concrete advice you would say? A psychologist can also be good to get to talk.
Yeah. I mean, I think I don't know that I could list other books. I think that's a good start, but I would say, listen, do more listening. Almost all of us could do more listening. And being a good listener is something that is so underrated and so important in developing relationships and really listening, like not waiting until it's your turn to talk about your thing, right? Which is what a lot of us do in conversation. And so I guess that's my shortest piece of advice is listen and notice what's going on with other people and try to show up and just call your friends. That's not really for the people who are struggling because they got to make the friends. But the rest of us, if you've got those friends, pick up the phone and call them.
I think that's a brilliant advice. I try to make it a habit. I wrote a book on habits as well. The habit of when I'm cleaning or other things or in transportation, that's the time when I have a possibility to connect. I might be busy with work and so on, but I have a possibility to call people and just be like, hey, how are you doing?
I do the exact same thing when I'm driving and in my life, like I don't drive every day because I'm not commuting and stuff. I work from home. But when I have these sort of couple of hour-long drives, I just go through and I call a whole bunch of people, and that's what I do. I put it on the speakerphone as a car, and it's a joke. They think it's funny now. They always know I'm in the car. Oh, where are you going, right? But it's exactly that. It's like you got to build into your life the ways of staying connected with people. You got to find the things like, and I know you said transactional, but for some people, it really works to actually put it in their calendar to say, I'm going to call so-and-so, or they go through their list and say, who haven't I not seen?
I have a list.
Do you have a list?
So some people say I'm very structured, but I have a list of some of my top friends, and then I make sure that I call the different ones, and I don't. So this is the person that I need to call. And I take each year and I try to reevaluate how much time do I have? Who are the ones that I want to pencil something in with?
There you go. So yeah. And I mean, it works, right?
It does.
It does work. It does keep you connected, and it keeps you refreshing and thinking about who's in your life and why. And I think that's great.
And it takes some effort, but it's definitely worth it. Like one of my good friends, another Mark, I have a lot of Marks in my life actually, that I always have such a good time with. I studied with him, and I realized I would love to see him more. So but my yearly, when I look at what I want to do, I was like, I want to try and find a weekly activity that I can do with him. So I called him and be like, hey, Mark, I would love to see you more.
Yeah.
What can we do? You want to go for like morning runs or sauna or just anything we could figure out? And yeah, we managed to do that. And then
that's great.
All right.
That's great. Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's exactly right. Being intentional about it is really what this is about, and finding those ways. And I also feel like if you have limited time, you can send like a funny text that's a joke that makes somebody laugh. When you make somebody laugh, there's like a positive connection that's established, and that doesn't take you that much time, but you've still connected. And you can say even, I don't have time this week, but I'm thinking of you, and or this thing, whatever. And so even little things like that make a difference, and they help. That's the glue that keeps you connected to people.
Yeah. Lydia, where can people find out more about you? I'll make sure to put all the links in the show notes.
Yeah. So my website, lydiadenworth.com, is pretty much the center of everything. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Lydia Denworth, and my books are available pretty much wherever books are sold. And yeah, I think that's probably it.
Fantastic. I always ask at the end, what are 1 to 3 advice you would give about how to live a happy, healthy, and meaningful life? I think you said a lot of gold in this episode, but if you had to sum up, maximum 3.
Right. Okay. Well, prioritize your relationships, sleep. I'm with you on the sleep. I mean, we haven't talked about that, oh gosh, I guess I should have thought about this earlier. I think living in the moment a little bit more is one of them, is because I think that actually helps with your friends too, is like recognizing that, not worrying as much about what's coming and saying, okay, this is the moment and I'm going to do this now. And this is important today and now. So I don't know if that's really my best advice, but that's what comes to mind. So prioritize your friendships, get some sleep, and then live in the moment a little bit more. It's what I'm trying to teach myself to do.
Yes. And that's it. I want to just mention before we end as well, the book that you wrote, which is called Toxic Truth, a scientist, a doctor, and the battle over lead. And I talked to a lot of people on the podcast, which is about something being told like this can never be cured, or this disease, and so on. And this is a book that I would love to do a full episode on as well.
Sure. Welcome back.
So that's a recommendation as well for the listeners. If you're curious.
It is. Yeah, no, it's one of the great public health success stories, is how we got rid of lead. Not entirely. No. There's still some problems, but it's an amazing story.
And we're having, for sure, many more things in our society that we're starting to see where whistleblowers are coming out about something health-wise that we should change.
Yeah.
I think this is...
And I think that book, I mean, obviously I'm going to sell it here, but what the case study of lead is really an example of a lot of other things that we're dealing with in our environment now, about the need to think ahead and to look at the effect that something's having. And so even if you think you're not that interested in lead, there's a lot to learn from that story. I think that applies to everything. It applies to climate change. It applies to how we've approached the pandemic. It applies to the uncertainties of science and of the world, but like how we need to think about that and make the best decisions we can make as we go along.
Yeah. So that's definitely a recommendation as well for someone listening, but I'll make sure to put it all in the show notes. So
okay, great.
Yeah. If you've been listening to the episode and you thought, okay, this is pretty interesting, I want to get closer into friendships, make sure to read the book. And if you're more curious about like how we're actually figuring out some things that we've been putting into our body or out into the environment, then that book, Toxic Truth, is also a good case to understand that. And then I'll put notes to your website and so on, Lydia. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yep, this was fun. Thanks so much. Call your friends.
I will. Bye.
Bye.